People ask me why I keep coming back to Michael Jackson. Honestly, because his story never finishes teaching you something new. Today, I'm taking you inside Neverland Ranch, the world he built with his own money and his own pain. Tomorrow, I'll show you the other side of him, the moments he refused to let anyone disrespect him. Stick around for both. 17 years after Michael Jackson died, there is a piece of land in Santa Barbara County that still cannot decide whether it's a home, a graveyard, or a myth. It used to have a Ferris wheel. It used to have a zoo. It used to have a train station with a full-time staff waiting to serve popcorn to guests who never had to leave the property to feel like they were somewhere magical. Today, most of that is gone. The name is gone. The rides are gone, but the story refuses to leave. And in 2024, of all things, it came roaring back because Hollywood walked right back onto the property to film a movie about the man who built it. This is the story of Neverland Ranch, not just the rooms and the price tags, but the reason Michael Jackson built a fortress of fantasy in the first place, and why the world's refusal to respect that fortress is the thing that finally tore it apart. Let's go inside. Before you even walk through the gates, you have to understand the name. Michael Jackson didn't call this place a ranch by accident. He named it after Peter Pan's Neverland, the island where a boy never has to grow up, never has to answer to anyone, never has to hand over the parts of himself the world keeps demanding. That single choice tells you almost everything about what this property was supposed to be. Jackson wasn't building a mansion to impress the neighbors. He was building a boundary, a line in the sand that said, inside these gates, the rules of fame do not apply, and neither does anyone else's permission to intrude. He bought the land in 1988 for around $17 million, and then spent the next several years pouring roughly $35 million more into turning it into something almost nobody else on earth could imagine, let alone afford. A 13,000 square foot French country home, a 4-acre lake with its own waterfall, a fully operating train station modeled after the one at Disneyland, a 50-seat private movie theater, a carousel, a Ferris wheel, a petting zoo stocked with llamas and chimpanzees, basketball and tennis courts, guest houses, a barn, even a firehouse. And the landscaping itself spelled out the word Neverland across the grounds in case anyone forgot exactly whose imagination they were standing inside. This was never meant to be looked at from the outside. It was meant to be entered, and only on his terms. Step through the front doors of the main house and you land in a foyer that Jackson used to greet his closest friends. Massive paintings covered the walls, some of them depicting Jackson himself in whimsical, almost fairy tale scenes. Statues stood throughout the room, including one of a butler holding out a tray of cookies, a small, strange, oddly tender detail meant to make guests feel welcome the second they walked in. At the far end of the foyer stood a two-sided marble clock so heavy that workers had to reinforce the floor beneath it, just so it wouldn't collapse into the basement. That's not a decorating choice. That's obsession. Every inch of this house was engineered to hold up under the weight of Jackson's vision, literally and figuratively. Down a few steps, the living room opened up, filled with couches, rugs, and a grand piano covered in framed photos of Jackson with his family and friends. Beside the fireplace sat a rotating pedestal holding an actual Academy Award, the Best Picture Oscar from Gone with the Wind, which Jackson had purchased for $1.5 million just so his guests could admire it up close. The kitchen floors were pulled from an 18th century French chateau, dismantled overseas, shipped to the United States piece by piece, and reassembled by craftsmen who ended up living near the property for years just to finish the job properly. Nothing here was random. Nothing here was close enough. Every room was Jackson insisting that his private world meet a standard nobody was allowed to lower. Not contractors, not guests, not even time itself. The private wing of the house tells its own story. To even reach Jackson's master bedroom suite, visitors had to pass a security code panel mounted on the wall, a literal barrier between the public parts of Neverland and the parts that belonged only to him. Inside, the bedroom itself was enormous, closer to the size of an entire home than a single room. It was 2 stories, with a spiral stairwell leading up to a sleeping loft where Jackson actually slept, in a bed covered, fittingly, in a fully sequined bedspread, the same material found in so many of his stage costumes. Down below, a walk-in closet connected to a jacuzzi, and wood floors ran throughout the entire suite. But tucked inside one of the closets was something stranger, a hidden cabinet with its own triple-lock security panel concealing a secret compartment behind what would have looked like an ordinary wall of hanging clothes. Nobody who has toured the property since seems entirely sure what was kept in there. What is clear is that Jackson wanted at least one part of his world that nobody else got to see, question, or judge. That's the quiet theme running through the entire house. Room after room built not just for beauty, but for control. Control over who got close. Control over what got seen. Control over a life that, outside these walls, had almost none left to give. Stretch your view out from the house itself, and the ranch becomes almost impossible to categorize. At its peak, the property spanned 2,700 acres and held as many as 22 separate structures. A private zoo, amusement rides, a rail line that carried guests and children across the grounds on an actual life-size train. This wasn't built to be admired from a distance. It was built to be lived inside, the same way Jackson wished he could have lived inside his own childhood, a childhood that had been consumed almost entirely by rehearsals, performances, and the demands of an audience that never stopped watching. Neverland was his attempt to build, decades later, the version of being young that fame had taken from him the first time around. Former staff who worked on the property have described just how much stuff kept arriving. Collectibles shipped in from overseas, decorative pieces for the bedroom, items Jackson simply liked and wanted near him, to the point where storage became an ongoing problem. It wasn't excess for its own sake. It was a man trying to fill a space large enough to finally feel safe in. Here's where the story turns, and where the deeper theme of this whole legacy starts to surface. Michael Jackson built Neverland as a boundary, and for years the outside world mostly respected it. But that respect didn't last. In 2003, law enforcement executed search warrants on the property as part of an investigation into allegations of misconduct. Officers moved through the grounds into staff offices, security buildings, and eventually into the house itself. The same rooms that had been designed as private sanctuary were now being treated as a crime scene. The trial that followed in 2005 ended in Jackson's acquittal on the charges brought against him. But by then, the damage to the property's meaning had already been done. Jackson left Neverland after the trial and never returned. Think about what that means. A man builds an entire universe specifically so the world can't reach the most vulnerable parts of him. And then the world reaches in anyway, publicly, and doesn't let go. Whatever you believe about the legal outcome, the ranch itself never recovered from that intrusion. It stopped being a home the moment its privacy was treated as optional. After Jackson's death in 2009, Neverland didn't just sit quietly and gather dust, it was actively taken apart. In 2008, Jackson had defaulted on a $24.5 million loan tied to the property. Once he was gone, Colony Capital, which had taken over financial control, began stripping the estate of its signature features: the petting zoo, the amusement rides. The pieces that had made Neverland feel like nowhere else on Earth were sold off, piece by piece. Some of those rides didn't just disappear into storage. They resurfaced at traveling fairs across California, Oregon, and Washington. Some found permanent homes at places like Coney Island. Picture that for a second. Rides that were once part of one man's private, guarded fantasy world, now sitting in public parks, ridden by strangers who have no idea where they came from. The private universe didn't vanish. It got broken up and scattered into the exact kind of public spectacle Jackson had built Neverland to escape in the first place. The price tag tells the same story in numbers. The ranch was first listed for $100 million in 2015, then $67 million, then $31 million. It finally sold in 2020 for $22 million to billionaire Ron Burkle, who renamed it Sycamore Valley Ranch. A property that once represented a level of obsessive customization almost nobody could match had been reduced over just a few years to a fraction of what it once claimed to be worth. But the story doesn't end in decay. By 2022, county permits confirmed that real work was happening on the site again. Roofing repairs, electrical upgrades, restoration of existing structures. Reports described regular activity moving in and out of the 2,700-acre property, consistent with an owner who intended to preserve what was left rather than let it rot. That matters because it means Neverland today isn't an abandoned ruin. It's a private, tightly controlled property that somebody is actively investing in, even if the public will likely never get anywhere near it again. In a strange way, that's the closest thing to the original mission of the place, keeping the world at arm's length while something valuable happens behind the gates. Then, in 2024, the story took its strangest turn yet. Film crews working on a Michael Jackson biopic were granted permits to shoot directly on the property. Dialogue scenes, petting zoo sequences, stunt work, all filmed on the actual land Jackson once built with his own money and his own imagination. But the production ran straight into the same tension that has followed Neverland from the beginning. How much of the real story is anyone allowed to tell? The filmmakers had originally planned to include a dramatized version of the 1993 raid on the property, and some of that footage was actually shot. Later, legal complications tied to Jackson's settlement with the Chandler family forced the production to cut that material entirely. So Neverland ended up doing something almost poetic. It became both the filming location for Jackson's story and the exact place where legal boundaries stopped that story from being told in full. Even now, on his own former land, there are still limits on what the world is allowed to say about Michael Jackson and what it isn't. Strip away the price tags and the headlines, and Neverland was never really about luxury. It was Michael Jackson's answer to a childhood he felt had been taken from him, and an attempt to build boundaries strong enough that no one could take anything from him again. A Ferris wheel and a petting zoo and a private train station weren't vanity. They were an insistence that his world deserved to be treated with the same care he put into every wood floor, every imported tile, every locked cabinet. And when that boundary got violated, first by a police raid, then by a trial, then by public scrutiny that never really stopped, Neverland stopped functioning as a home almost overnight. It became evidence. It became controversy. It became eventually something closer to a memorial than a residence. The rides are gone now. The name is gone, but the land is still there, still enormous, still sitting exactly where Michael Jackson left it in 2005, never to return. And every few years, the story finds a way to pull itself back into the conversation. A documentary, a biopic, a permit filing, a new owner's renovation crew. Because Neverland was never just about one man's fortune. It was about what happens when someone tries to build a world that demands respect, and the outside world decides it's entitled to walk right through the gates anyway. That, more than the lake or the theater or the 22 structures, is the real story buried underneath 2,700 acres in Santa Barbara County. And it's exactly the story I want to pick back up tomorrow when we talk about the other times in Michael Jackson's life when he made it very clear some lines were not meant to be crossed. If this kind of deep dive is what you come here for, let me know in the comments, hit subscribe, and turn on notifications so you don't miss the next one.